Dr. Frank Morrison's weathered hands froze mid-injection, the syringe trembling as he stared into the amber eyes of the dying lioness. What he saw around her neck wasn't a research collar. It was a handmade beaded necklace spelling Sarah M. in his dead daughter's childish handwriting. Jake Thompson stumbled backward, his coffee cup shattering against the Kenyan dirt as the metallic tang of blood filled the scorching air. The massive male lion circled closer, his golden mane bristling with protective fury, yet his eyes held something Morrison had never seen in 30 years of medicine, a desperate plea for help. This was the same lioness his daughter Sarah had written about before the helicopter crash 8 years ago, the one she'd promised to protect with her life. Now Sahara was dying in childbirth, and Morrison faced an impossible choice: follow conservation law and watch her die, or risk everything to save the last living connection to his child. "Help her, Doc," Jake whispered, his voice cracking, "or we lose them all." Time was running out, and somewhere in the gathering dusk, other forces were already moving to claim what Morrison was fighting to save. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Dr. Frank Morrison had been counting pills in his empty house in Colorado Springs, wondering if 40 Percocet would be enough to join Margaret and Sarah. The 4-bedroom colonial felt like a mausoleum, filled with 40 years of memories that now cut like glass every time he walked past family photos. At 68, the retired cardiac surgeon had outlived his usefulness. His hands shook too badly for surgery. His heart was broken beyond repair, and his purpose had died with his daughter in that godforsaken helicopter crash in Afghanistan. Margaret's voice still echoed through the halls. "Frank, your heart's too big for this world." She'd said it the day she died, her hand cold in his as the cancer finally won. Sarah had inherited that same oversized heart, becoming an Army veterinarian who'd rather save wounded animals than kill enemy soldiers. Both women were gone now, leaving Frank alone with $2.3 million in assets and absolutely nothing to live for. The decision to leave came when he found Sarah's childhood stuffed lion in the attic, along with a stack of letters she'd sent from Africa. "Dad," one letter read, "I've found the most amazing conservation project in Kenya. These lions are like family to each other. They love, they grieve, they protect, just like us." She'd written about funding a facility in Masai Mara, about a pregnant lioness she'd helped save years before. "If anything happens to me, promise you'll take care of them." Frank had failed to keep that promise for 8 years. He'd been too buried in grief, too consumed by guilt for surviving when his girls hadn't. But reading Sarah's words again, he heard Margaret's voice. "Frank Morrison, you stop feeling sorry for yourself and do something useful with that stubborn heart of yours." 3 days later, he'd booked a one-way ticket to Nairobi. His sister Alice thought he'd lost his mind. "Frank, you're almost 70. What are you going to do in Africa?" He'd hung up without answering because he didn't know. All he knew was that staying in Colorado meant dying slowly, pill by pill, memory by memory. The flight gave him 18 hours to second-guess everything. He was too old, too broken, too American for this. But somewhere over the Atlantic, Frank Morrison made peace with his decision. If he was going to die anyway, he might as well die trying to honor his daughter's memory. Sarah had always said the best way to heal a broken heart was to use it to help someone else's. As the plane descended into Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, Frank clutched Sarah's letters and whispered a prayer to Margaret. "Help me find a reason to keep breathing." He had no idea that in 6 months he'd be kneeling beside a dying lioness who would change everything he thought he knew about love, loss, and the connections that transcend species and even death itself. The African sun hit Frank Morrison like a physical blow as he stepped off the bus at Masai Mara Conservation Facility. After 48 hours of travel, his arthritis screamed protests, and the thin mountain air made his damaged heart work overtime. This wasn't the sanitized Kenya of tourist brochures. This was raw, unforgiving wilderness that didn't care about his American expectations or his grief. Jake Thompson emerged from a dusty Land Rover, all military bearing and suspicious eyes. At 45, the former Iraq War veteran moved with the careful precision of a man who'd seen too much and trusted too little. His handshake was firm, but his smile never reached his eyes. "Doc Morrison, welcome to the real Africa. Hope you brought more than good intentions." The conservation facility sprawled across 50 acres of acacia-dotted savanna, a collection of weathered buildings and chain-link enclosures that housed 12 lions in various stages of rehabilitation. "Doctor." Richard Blackwood, the British director, greeted Frank with colonial charm and a grip that lasted too long. "Wonderful to have American expertise, Doctor. Your donation potential, your medical background, will be invaluable here." Something about Blackwood's smile reminded Frank of the pharmaceutical reps who'd courted him back in Denver. Too smooth, too eager, hiding something behind practiced sincerity. But Frank pushed the thought aside. He was here for Sarah, not to analyze personalities. The first time Frank saw Sahara, his breath caught in his throat. The 6-year-old lioness carried herself with a dignity that reminded him painfully of Margaret, regal even in captivity, her amber eyes holding depths of intelligence that seemed almost human. She was visibly pregnant, her belly swollen with cubs that would arrive within weeks. "Beautiful, isn't she?" Blackwood said, his tone oddly proprietary. "Sahara's one of our prize-breeding females. Excellent genetic stock. The male, Django, has been quite protective lately, almost aggressively so." Django paced the perimeter of their enclosure, a magnificent specimen with a full mane that caught the golden afternoon light. Unlike most captive lions Frank had seen in zoos, these two seemed alert, healthy, almost wild despite their confinement. But something else caught his attention, a flash of color around Sahara's neck. "What's that she's wearing?" Frank asked, squinting through the chain link. "Oh, that old thing?" Blackwood's laugh sounded forced. "Local crafts. The Maasai workers get sentimental about the animals. Harmless tradition." But as Frank moved closer, his heart began to pound. The necklace wasn't just local crafts. It was a specific pattern of blue and white beads that triggered a memory so sharp it nearly dropped him to his knees. Sarah, age 8, sitting at their kitchen table in Colorado, tongue poking out in concentration as she strung identical beads for a summer camp project. Jake noticed Frank's sudden pallor. "Doc, you okay? This heat can get to newcomers." Frank steadied himself against the fence, his medical training warring with impossible recognition. He needed a closer look, needed to confirm what his mind was refusing to accept. "I'd like to examine her," he said quietly. "Check her pregnancy progress." "Absolutely not." Blackwood's response was immediate and sharp. "Our policy is strict non-interference. These are wild animals, Dr. Morrison. We let nature take its course. But if there are complications, there won't be. Sahara's had successful births before." Blackwood's tone brooked no argument. "We run a natural conservation program here, not a zoo. The lions live as they would in the wild." That night, Frank lay awake in his Spartan guest quarters, staring at the ceiling as lions roared in the distance. Something was wrong here. He could feel it in his surgeon's gut, the same instinct that had saved countless patients over the years. Blackwood's refusal to allow medical examination, the nervous way Jake avoided eye contact when discussing the facility's operations, the expensive equipment that seemed out of place for a small conservation outfit. But it was the necklace that haunted him most. In his carry-on bag, Frank had brought one of Sarah's childhood photo albums, insurance against forgetting her face as his grief aged. He found the picture he was looking for. Sarah, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up an identical beaded necklace. "For the lions, Daddy," her 8-year-old voice echoed across the years. "So they know someone loves them." Frank's hands shook as he held the photograph. Sarah had been fascinated by lions since childhood, had chosen veterinary medicine specifically to work with large predators. Her letters from Afghanistan had mentioned previous conservation work in Kenya, funding she'd arranged through military channels for various wildlife projects. As dawn broke over the Masai Mara, Frank Morrison sat on his narrow cot and made a decision that would either save his sanity or destroy what remained of his life. He was going to find out exactly how his dead daughter's childhood necklace had ended up around the neck of a pregnant lioness 6,000 miles from home. Even if the truth killed him, Frank Morrison's hands trembled as he zoomed in on the photograph on his phone, comparing it to the beaded pattern around Sahara's neck. The match was undeniable. Same blue and white sequence, same hand-knotted technique Sarah had learned at summer camp 20 years ago. His chest tightened with the familiar ache of cardiac stress, but this time it wasn't grief. It was recognition mixed with something far more dangerous. Hope. Jake found him at dawn, sitting outside Sahara's enclosure with his back against the fence. The lioness had positioned herself barely 3 feet away, separated only by chain link, as if she sensed something familiar in the old man's presence. Django lay protectively beside her, his massive head resting on his paws, but his eyes never left Frank's face. "Doc, you've been out here all night," Jake said, settling beside him with 2 cups of coffee. "Talk to me." "What's eating at you?" Frank pulled out the childhood photograph, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and emotion. "This necklace. Sarah made it when she was 8 years old. Identical pattern, identical beads." "Jake, how the hell did my dead daughter's craft project end up on a lioness in Kenya?" Jake's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. The color drained from his weathered face as he stared at the photograph, then at Sahara's necklace, then back at Frank with an expression of dawning horror. "Oh, Jesus Christ. Doc, I need to tell you something. I should have told you the moment you arrived." "What are you talking about?" Jake's hands shook as he set down his coffee. "Sarah Morrison, Army veterinarian, died in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan 8 years ago. Brown hair, green eyes, had a laugh that could light up a room." Frank nodded, afraid to breathe. "Doc, I knew your daughter. We served together for 6 months before she died." The world tilted sideways. Frank gripped the fence until his knuckles went white. "That's impossible. Sarah never mentioned anyone named Jake Thompson." "Because I wasn't Jake Thompson then," Jake's voice cracked. "I was Staff Sergeant Jason Kowalski. I changed my name after what happened. Doc, I was driving the vehicle that night, the one that got hit by the IED. Sarah was in the passenger seat and He broke down completely. 20 years of military composure crumbling. "I should have died instead of her." Frank's medical training kicked in automatically. Shallow breathing, rapid pulse, signs of severe PTSD episode. But beneath the clinical observation, his heart was breaking all over again. This broken man beside him had held his daughter's hand as she died, had heard her last words, had carried survivor's guilt for 8 years just as Frank had carried his own. "What were her last words?" Frank whispered. Jake wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "She made me promise to find this place. Said she'd been funding a conservation project here, something about protecting a lioness named Sahara. She gave me coordinates, made me swear on my mother's grave that I'd make sure the lions were safe. That's why I'm here, Doc. I've been keeping that promise for 8 years." "The necklace?" "Sarah had it in her field pack. Said it was good luck from her childhood, Something about lions knowing someone loved them. Before the medics arrived, she made me take it. Said if I ever found Sahara, I should put it on her so she'd know Sarah kept her word. Frank stared at Sahara, who had moved even closer to the fence. The lioness was watching him with an intensity that seemed to pierce through to his soul. "You put this necklace on her?" 3 years ago, when I first arrived, found Sahara in a breeding program here, pregnant with her first litter. The moment I put that necklace around her neck, she looked at me like she understood. Like she was waiting for it. A terrible possibility was forming in Frank's mind. "Jake, what exactly did Sarah tell you about this place? What kind of funding was she providing?" Jake's expression darkened. "She said it was legitimate conservation work, protecting breeding pairs, maintaining genetic diversity. She was sending money through military channels, about $50,000 over 2 years. But Doc..." He glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "Things here don't add up. The equipment's too expensive, Blackwood's too evasive about funding sources, and some of the lions have disappeared without explanation." "What do you mean, disappeared?" 6 lions in the past year. Blackwood claims they were transferred to other facilities, but there's no paperwork, no transport records. And yesterday, I overheard him on the phone talking about buyers and shipping schedules. Frank's surgeon instincts, honed by decades of life and death decisions, suddenly crystallized around a horrifying possibility. "Jake, I think we need to look at Blackwood's computer files. Tonight." "Doc, that's breaking and entering. We could get arrested, deported, or worse." Frank stood up slowly, his arthritis protesting, but his resolve hardening into something he hadn't felt since Margaret's diagnosis. "My daughter died believing she was protecting these lions. If someone's been betraying that trust, using her money to fund something evil..." He looked at Sahara, who was now standing at the fence, her amber eyes locked on his. "I didn't save Sarah. I couldn't save Margaret. But I'll be damned if I let anyone hurt what she died trying to protect." That night, as Blackwood drove into town for his weekly supply run, Frank and Jake broke into the facility's office. What they found in the computer files made Frank's blood run cold. Purchase orders for shipping containers, correspondence with hunting lodges in Texas, financial records showing payments of $50,000 per specimen. Sarah's conservation funding hadn't been protecting lions. It had been subsidizing their sale to American trophy hunters. Frank sank into Blackwood's chair, the weight of betrayal crushing down on him. His daughter had died believing she was saving lives, when in reality her money had been financing their deaths. And in 10 days, when Sahara gave birth, she and her cubs would join the list of shipped specimens. "We have to stop this," Frank whispered. Jake checked his watch. "Blackwood will be back in 2 hours. Doc, if we're going to do something, it has to be now." Frank looked at the financial records one more time, then at the photograph of Sarah with her childhood necklace. His daughter's voice echoed across the years. "For the lions, Daddy." "So they know someone loves them." "Get me Blackwood's satellite phone," Frank said quietly. "I'm about to make some very expensive phone calls." Frank Morrison's first call was to his financial advisor in Denver at 3 a.m. local time. "Tom, it's Frank. I need you to liquidate everything. The mutual funds, the CDs, Margaret's life insurance, all of it." "Frank, are you having another episode? It's 3 in the morning and you're talking about liquidating $2 million. Maybe we should discuss this when you're back from your vacation." "I'm not coming back, Tom. Wire the money to this account number." Frank read off Blackwood's banking information from the computer screen. "I'm buying myself a conservation facility." The second call was harder. Alice, Margaret's sister, had been like a mother to Sarah after Margaret died. Her voice was thick with sleep and worry. "Frank, what's wrong? Are you hurt?" "Alice, I need you to put the house on the market. Everything in it, too. The furniture, Margaret's china, my medical books, sell it all. Frank's voice cracked as he spoke. Each item represented a lifetime of memories, but Sarah's betrayed trust mattered more than sentiment. Frank Morrison, you listen to me. You're having a breakdown. When you get home, we're going to get you some help. Maybe find you a nice assisted living. Alice, Margaret kept a separate life insurance policy, $2 million. She left me a letter with the policy documents, said it was for my mission, not my comfort. I think I finally understand what she meant. Frank hung up before Alice could argue further. Jake watched from the doorway, his face pale in the computer screen's glow. Doc, you're talking about your entire life savings, your future, your security, everything. What future? Frank's laugh was bitter. Sitting in that empty house, counting pills, waiting to die? Jake, I'm 68 years old. How much security do I really need for the time I have left? Over the next 3 hours, Frank orchestrated the systematic dismantling of his American life. He sold Margaret's engagement ring to a Denver jewelry store over the phone, $25,000 that had taken him 2 years to save for in 1978. He mortgaged the house for $400,000, the same house where he'd carried Margaret over the threshold as a bride, where Sarah had taken her first steps. Each transaction felt like tearing away a piece of his soul, but with every dollar transferred, Frank felt something else growing inside him. Purpose. For the first time since Margaret's death, he was fighting for something instead of just enduring. Jake couldn't sit still. He paced the small office like a caged animal, his military training warring with his protective instincts. Doc, if Blackwood figures out what we're doing, we're dead. Not arrested, dead. These hunting lodge operations have serious money behind them, serious connections. Then we better work fast. Frank's third call was to Mary Ochieng, a local Maasai guide Jake had mentioned. Her English was careful but clear. Dr. Morrison, Jake has told me about you. What can I do to help? Mary, I need to understand something. Are lions sacred to your people? Sacred is not the right word. They are our brothers, our neighbors. We share the same land, the same struggles. When the colonial government forced us into reserves, the lions lost their territory too. We understand each other. If someone was selling those lions to be killed for sport, how would your people feel about that? The silence stretched so long Frank thought the connection had dropped. When Mary spoke again, her voice carried quiet fury. Dr. Morrison, such a person would be committing a crime against the ancestors themselves. What are you telling me? Frank explained everything. Sarah's betrayed funding, the shipping records, the hunting lodge connections. With each revelation, he could hear Mary's breathing grow more labored. When he finished, she spoke one word. When? Sahara's cubs are due in 7 days. According to these files, Blackwood has buyers scheduled to arrive the day after birth. I will speak to the elders tonight. Dr. Morrison, you should know, Jake Thompson is considered family here. He has honored his promise to your daughter for 3 years. The Maasai do not forget such loyalty. The fourth call nearly broke Frank's resolve. His nephew Michael in Colorado Springs had been Sarah's favorite cousin, the closest thing to a brother she'd ever had. Uncle Frank! Jesus, it's 4 in the morning. Are you okay? Michael, I need you to go to the house. In Sarah's room there's a photo album on her desk. Red leather cover. I need you to scan every page and email them to me. Sarah's room? Uncle Frank, you said we weren't supposed to go in there. You haven't been in there yourself since the funeral. Frank closed his eyes, seeing Sarah's bedroom as he'd left it 8 years ago. Purple comforter, veterinary textbooks, photos of lions and elephants covering every wall. I know what I said, but I was wrong, Michael. Sarah didn't want her room to be a shrine. She wanted it to be a launching pad for something bigger. 2 hours later, the emails arrived. Frank scrolled through image after image of Sarah's life. Graduation from veterinary school, her deployment photos, pictures with fellow soldiers. But it was the last album that stopped his heart. Page after page of African wildlife, lions in particular, with careful notes in Sarah's handwriting. Sahara, age 3, first successful birth. Django, rescued from snare injury, fully recovered. Conservation funding approved, $50,000 annual commitment. Jake looked over Frank's shoulder at the laptop screen. Doc, look at the dates. Some of these photos were taken just weeks before she died. Frank's hands trembled as he studied the images. Sarah hadn't just been funding this project. She'd been personally involved, visiting the facility, monitoring the lion's health. The last photo showed her kneeling beside a younger Sahara, both hands on the lioness's pregnant belly, her face radiant with joy. She loved them, Frank whispered. They weren't just a project to her. They were family. The final financial call came at dawn. Frank's retirement account manager, awakened by the urgency in Frank's voice, walked him through liquidating his entire 401k, over $800,000 accumulated over 40 years of surgical practice. The tax penalties alone would cost him nearly $200,000. Dr. Morrison, I have to advise you that this decision is financially catastrophic. You're talking about impoverishing yourself for your remaining years. Frank watched through the office window as Sahara paced her enclosure, her pregnancy making movement difficult, but her protective instincts keeping her alert. Django shadowed her every step, occasionally nuzzling her neck in reassurance. I've been poor before, Frank said quietly. I was poor when I married Margaret. Poor when Sarah was born. We were happy then. Maybe money isn't the kind of security I actually need. By 6 a.m., Frank Morrison had transferred over $2.8 million into various accounts, enough to buy the conservation facility outright and establish an endowment for its operation. He was now worth approximately $3,000 and owned nothing but the clothes in his suitcase. Jake stared at the computer screen showing the completed transfers. Doc, what you just did, it's either the most generous thing I've ever seen or the craziest. Probably both. Frank stood up from Blackwood's desk, his arthritic joints protesting after hours of phone calls and computer work. Jake, I need you to understand something. When Margaret was dying, she made me promise to find a reason to keep living. For 3 years, I thought that was impossible. But Sarah's been trying to tell me what that reason was all along. They heard vehicles approaching, Blackwood returning from town with his weekly supply run. Jake quickly shut down the computer while Frank gathered the printed financial documents they'd need as evidence. What's our next move? Jake asked. Frank looked out the window at Sahara's enclosure. The lioness had positioned herself at the fence closest to the office building, almost as if she could sense the importance of what had just transpired. Her amber eyes met his through the glass, and Frank felt something pass between them, recognition, gratitude, hope. Now we tell Blackwood that his operation just got bought out from under him, Frank said, and we pray that the legal ownership transfers go through before he figures out how to stop us. Jake checked his sidearm, a habit from his military days. Doc, men like Blackwood don't usually accept defeat gracefully. When he realizes what you've done, he's going to fight back. Hard. Frank thought about Margaret's last words. Your heart's too big for this world, but maybe that's exactly what the world needs. He thought about Sarah's childhood promise to protect the lions and her adult commitment to that same promise. He thought about the empty house in Colorado that had been slowly killing him with its silence and memories. Let him fight, Frank said quietly. I've already lost everything that mattered to me. But maybe that means I've got nothing left to lose. As Blackwood's Land Rover pulled up to the main building, Frank Morrison prepared for the confrontation that would either save Sarah's lions or destroy what remained of his life. Either way, he was finally honoring the promises he'd failed to keep to the two women who'd loved him most. Dr. Richard Blackwood's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally murderous rage as Frank Morrison calmly explained the morning's financial transactions. The British conservationist's colonial composure cracked like thin ice, revealing something far more dangerous underneath. "You senile American fool," Blackwood snarled, his accent sharpening with fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Those lions are worth more than your pathetic retirement savings. I have contracts, obligations to people who don't accept disappointment gracefully." Frank stood his ground despite his racing heart. "Those lions were bought with my daughter's blood money. Your contracts are void as of this morning. I own this facility now, and the first order of business is shutting down your hunting operation." Blackwood's laugh was cold and brittle. "Own it? You think a few wire transfers make you the owner?" "Morrison, you're about to learn how business really works in Africa." He pulled out his satellite phone. "One call to my contacts in Nairobi, and you'll be on the next plane to Denver, assuming you live that long." Jake stepped forward, his military bearing radiating controlled violence. "Dr. Blackwood, I'd think very carefully about your next move. The doc here just became a very important person, and important people tend to have protection." As if summoned by Jake's words, the sound of approaching vehicles filled the morning air. Mary Ochieng arrived first, driving a battered pickup truck loaded with 6 Maasai elders in traditional dress. Behind her came 2 more vehicles carrying local community leaders, word having spread through the tribal network faster than any modern communication system. Mary emerged from her truck with the fluid grace of someone born to this land. "Dr. Morrison," she said formally, "the Council of Elders has voted. This facility is now under the protection of the Maasai people. Dr. Blackwood, you are no longer welcome on our ancestral lands." Blackwood's face went purple with rage. "You have no authority here. This is private property, licensed by the Kenyan government. A bunch of tribespeople can't just—" "Dr. Blackwood," interrupted a new voice. Joseph Kimani, a Kenyan Wildlife Service officer, stepped out of an official vehicle that had arrived unnoticed. "We've received some very disturbing reports about your operations here. I'm going to need to see your shipping manifests and financial records immediately." Frank felt a surge of vindication mixed with terror. The net was closing around Blackwood, but cornered animals were at their most dangerous. He could see the calculation in the British man's eyes, weighing options that likely included violence. "This is a setup," Blackwood declared. "Morrison, you've been planning this from the moment you arrived." "Well, you want to play hardball? Fine." He raised his satellite phone. "One call to my partners in Texas, and this place becomes a war zone. You think these local officials can protect you from the kind of money I represent?" The sound that cut through the tension was unexpected, a low, rumbling roar from Sahara's enclosure. The lioness had positioned herself at the fence, her amber eyes fixed on the group of humans with an intensity that seemed almost supernatural. Django stood beside her, his massive frame coiled with protective energy. Mary spoke quietly to the elders in Swahili, then turned to Frank. "Dr. Morrison, Mzee Sankali says the lions are choosing sides. They sense the danger to their cubs." Frank approached Sahara's enclosure, his arthritic legs carrying him forward on pure determination. The lioness moved closer to the fence, her pregnant belly making movement awkward, but her gaze never wavering from his face. When he was close enough to touch the chain link, she did something extraordinary. She lowered her head and pressed her forehead against the fence where Frank's hand rested. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered. "Doc, I've never seen anything like that." Frank felt tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he pressed his palm against the fence. Through the metal links he could feel the warmth of Sahara's fur, the steady rhythm of her breathing. "Sarah," he whispered, "I'm so sorry it took me this long." Blackwood's voice cut through the moment like a blade. How touching. The senile old man talking to animals. "Morrison, you're about to learn that sentiment doesn't stop bullets." Frank turned to face Blackwood, his surgeon's composure steady despite the threat. "Richard, I've spent 3 years wanting to die. Do you really think threatening my life is going to scare me?" "Not your life, old man. Theirs." Blackwood gestured toward the lion enclosure. "One call to my hunting partners and they'll be here tomorrow with high-powered rifles. Your precious lions will be trophies hanging in Texas mansions before the week is out." The threat hit Frank like a physical blow. He'd been prepared to sacrifice himself, but the thought of Sahara and Django dying because of his intervention was unbearable. Margaret's voice echoed in his memory. "Frank, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is know when to fold." But before Frank could respond, Jake stepped forward with the deadly calm of a soldier who'd made peace with violence. "Dr. Blackwood, let me explain something to you about American military veterans. We don't react well to threats against innocent lives. You're one man, Thompson. My associates are many, and they're well armed." "Actually," said a new voice, "he's not alone." Frank turned to see a convoy of vehicles approaching, trucks filled with local Maasai warriors, Kenya Wildlife Service rangers, and most surprisingly, a Land Rover bearing the insignia of the American Embassy in Nairobi. A tall woman in her 50s emerged from the embassy vehicle, her bearing suggesting both diplomatic authority and military background. "Dr. Morrison, I'm Susan Martinez, cultural attaché from the American Embassy. We received some very interesting calls this morning about an American citizen making substantial investments in Kenyan conservation." Frank's confusion must have shown on his face because she smiled slightly. "Your nephew Michael contacted our office when he couldn't reach you directly. Seems your financial advisor was concerned about elderly exploitation and international fraud. We decided to investigate." Blackwood's satellite phone rang at that moment, his face going ashen as he answered. Frank could only hear one side of the conversation, but Blackwood's increasingly desperate tone told the story. "No, I can fix this. The old man doesn't understand what he's interfering with. Yes, I know what happens to people who disappoint you." When Blackwood ended the call, his face had gone gray with fear. "Morrison, you have no idea what you've started. My partners don't accept failure. They'll come for the lions and they'll come for you, and there's nothing your embassy friends can do to stop them." Frank felt a strange calm settle over him. Standing here in the African sun, surrounded by people who'd rallied to protect Sarah's dream, he realized something profound. For 3 years he'd been running from death. But death had always been coming anyway. For him, for everyone. The only choice was what you did with the time you had left. "Let them come," Frank said quietly. "Richard, you made one critical mistake. You thought I was just a lonely old man with money. But I'm not alone anymore." He gestured toward the growing crowd of supporters. "And more importantly, I'm not afraid anymore." Sahara roared again, a sound of pure defiance that echoed across the savannah. Django joined her, their combined voices carrying a message that needed no translation. The lions were ready to fight for their family. Frank Morrison looked at the lioness wearing his dead daughter's necklace, at Jake Thompson carrying 8 years of survivor's guilt, at Mary Oching defending her ancestral values, at the Maasai elders who'd accepted a stranger into their protection. This was what Margaret had meant about his heart being too big for the world. She'd been wrong about one thing, though. The world was exactly big enough for hearts like his. "Dr. Blackwood," Frank said, his voice carrying the authority of a surgeon who'd made life-and-death decisions for 40 years. "You have 24 hours to vacate this facility. After that, you'll be dealing with more than just one old American and his conscience. As the sun climbed higher over the Masai Mara, Frank Morrison prepared for the fight of his life. Not for his own survival, but for the promise he'd failed to keep to his daughter and the family she'd died trying to protect. The attack came at 3:17 a.m., 3 days after Blackwood's ultimatum expired. Frank Morrison was awake, as he'd been every night since taking control of the facility, sitting vigil beside Sahara's enclosure as her labor pains intensified. The lioness had been in distress for 18 hours, her contractions growing weaker instead of stronger, a classic sign of dystocia that could kill both mother and cubs within hours. The first gunshot shattered the pre-dawn silence like breaking glass. Jake's military training kicked in instantly as he rolled from his cot, weapon in hand, but the muzzle flash in the darkness revealed the attackers' tactical advantage. They'd surrounded the facility with professional precision, cutting the power and communication lines before beginning their assault. "Doc, get down!" Jake shouted, tackling Frank behind a concrete barrier as bullets sparked off the chain-link fencing. Through the chaos, Frank could hear Sahara's agonized roars mixing with the crack of rifle fire. She was trying to give birth while gunmen stormed the facility that was supposed to protect her. Frank's medical instincts warred with terror as he watched Sahara collapse in her enclosure, her body racked with contractions that were growing dangerously weak. "Jake, she's dying. The stress is stopping her labor. If I don't operate now, we'll lose them all." "Doc, if you go out there, they'll kill you. These aren't local poachers. This is a professional operation. Military-grade weapons, night vision, coordinated assault. Blackwood's hunting partners don't play games." Another volley of gunfire erupted, this time from the perimeter where Mary's Maasai warriors were returning fire with hunting rifles and traditional weapons. The sound of breaking glass indicated the attackers were shooting out the facility's floodlights, systematically eliminating any advantage the defenders might have had. In the enclosure, Django had positioned himself protectively over Sahara's prostrate form, his roars of fury audible even over the gunfire. The massive male lion understood the threat to his mate and unborn cubs, but was powerless to defend them against enemies he couldn't reach. Frank made a decision that surprised even himself. Drawing on 40 years of surgical training, he compartmentalized his fear and focused solely on the medical emergency in front of him. "Jake, I need you to create a distraction. Draw their fire toward the main building." "Doc, that's suicide. You can't perform surgery in the middle of a firefight. I've operated in emergency rooms during gang wars, in field hospitals during natural disasters." "This is just another emergency." Frank's voice carried the calm authority that had saved countless lives over 4 decades. "Sarah died believing I would protect these lions. I will not fail her again." Jake stared at Frank with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "You're completely insane, old man. But you're also the bravest son of a bitch I've ever met." He checked his rifle and moved toward the main building. "Give me 2 minutes to get their attention, then do what you have to do." The distraction Jake created was spectacular and terrifying. Using his military demolitions training, he rigged the facility's generator to explode, sending a fireball into the night sky that temporarily blinded the attackers' night vision equipment. In the confusion that followed, Frank Morrison did something that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew him as a cautious suburban retiree. He sprinted across open ground under hostile fire to reach Sahara's enclosure. The gate lock had been damaged by a stray bullet, allowing Frank to slip inside with the medical bag he'd prepared for exactly this emergency. Sahara was unconscious now, her breathing shallow and rapid, her body shutting down from stress and exhaustion. Frank could feel the cubs moving weakly inside her distended abdomen, their lives measured in minutes rather than hours. Django's reaction to Frank's presence was extraordinary. Instead of attacking the human who'd invaded his territory during a crisis, the massive lion seemed to understand Frank's intentions. He positioned himself between Frank and the gunfire, using his own body as a shield, while the old surgeon worked to save his mate. Frank's hands, which had shaken with grief and age for years, became steady as granite once he began the emergency procedure. Working by feel in the near darkness, he made the crucial incision and reached inside Sahara's birth canal to manually reposition the first cub. The procedure was brutally primitive compared to modern veterinary surgery, but it was Sahara's only chance. The first cub emerged stillborn, its tiny body lifeless in Frank's bloodied hands. The second followed quickly, also showing no signs of life. Frank's heart broke as he realized he might be too late, that all his sacrifice and determination might amount to nothing more than prolonging Sahara's suffering. But the third cub, the smallest and most fragile, gasped weakly as Frank cleared fluid from its airways. The tiny lioness mewed pitifully, her cries barely audible over the continuing gunfire, but to Frank it sounded like the most beautiful music he'd ever heard. The gunfire was intensifying now, moving closer to the enclosures as the attackers realized where Frank had gone. Jake's voice carried across the chaos. "Doc, we've got to move. They're closing in." Frank looked down at Sahara, who was barely conscious but alive. The surviving cub was nursing weakly, its tiny paws kneading its mother's belly in the ancient rhythm of life itself. Django nuzzled his mate gently, his massive head lowering to sniff the new cub with tender care. "I can't leave them," Frank called back to Jake. "If the attackers get to the enclosure, they'll kill them all." "Then we make our stand here," Jake replied, his voice carrying the finality of a soldier who'd accepted death. "Doc, it's been an honor serving with you." As the gunmen approached the lion enclosures, Frank Morrison knelt beside Sahara and her newborn cub, one hand resting on the lioness's flank and the other holding the tiny life he'd just helped bring into the world. This was not how he'd imagined his life ending, but as Margaret had always said, life rarely followed the plans you made for it. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, accompanied by harsh voices speaking in accented English about cleaning up loose ends and eliminating witnesses. Frank closed his eyes and whispered a prayer to Margaret and Sarah. "I kept my promise. I saved what I could save." When he opened his eyes, Django was looking directly at him with an expression of what could only be described as gratitude. The great lion seemed to understand that this old human had risked everything to save his family, and that knowledge passed between them like an unspoken covenant. Whatever happened next, Frank Morrison had finally found the purpose Margaret had urged him to seek. In the space between heartbeats, surrounded by the sounds of violence and the miracle of new life, he understood that some victories were worth any price. The footsteps stopped just outside the enclosure fence. Frank Morrison looked up from Sahara and her newborn cub to see 3 armed men in tactical gear, their assault rifles trained on him through the chain link. The leader, a scarred man with dead eyes, spoke with a Texas drawl that chilled Frank's blood. "Well, well, the famous Dr. Morrison. You've caused us a lot of trouble, old man." The gunman's finger moved to his trigger. "Nothing personal, but you've interfered with a very profitable operation." Frank's hands remained steady on Sahara's flank, protecting the tiny cub that represented everything he'd fought for. "Before you pull that trigger, you should know something. I've documented everything. Blackwood's hunting operation, the financial records, the shipping manifests. It's all been sent to the FBI, Interpol, and the Kenyan authorities." The leader laughed coldly. "Nice try, Doc. But we've been monitoring all communications from this facility. Nothing's gotten out." That's when Frank Morrison smiled for the first time in days. "You monitored the facility's communications, But you didn't monitor Mary Ochieng's personal satellite phone or the American Embassy's encrypted channels or the Maasai tribal network that's been broadcasting this story across East Africa for the past 3 days. The gunman's confidence flickered. You're bluffing. Am I? Frank's voice carried the calm authority of a surgeon who'd made life-and-death decisions for 40 years. Tell me, how many international news crews do you think are en route to this location right now? How many governments are asking uncomfortable questions about American citizens funding illegal hunting operations in Kenya? Before the gunman could respond, the sound of helicopters filled the night air. Not the single aircraft Frank had been expecting, but multiple choppers approaching from different directions. The tactical team leader spoke rapidly into his radio, his composure finally cracking. "Sir, we've got multiple aircraft inbound. Looks like Kenyan military and—" "Jesus, that's an American news helicopter with CNN markings." Frank's smile widened. "I told you I'd documented everything. But what I didn't mention is that my nephew Michael works for Anderson Cooper's production team. Funny how family connections work, isn't it?" The first helicopter to land disgorged not soldiers but a mixed team of Kenyan Wildlife Service officers, FBI agents, and international journalists. Susan Martinez from the American Embassy emerged from the second aircraft, flanked by armed diplomatic security personnel. "Dr. Morrison," she called out, "are you and the animals secure?" "We're alive," Frank replied, never taking his eyes off the gunmen who were now surrounded and outnumbered. "Sahara gave birth an hour ago. One cub survived." The tactical team leader's radio crackled with orders Frank couldn't make out, but the man's face went ashen as he listened. When the transmission ended, he slowly lowered his weapon. "Stand down," he told his team. "We're pulling out." "Like hell you are!" Jake Thompson emerged from behind a concrete barrier, his rifle trained on the retreating gunman. "You came here to murder innocent people and animals. You're not walking away from this." Susan Martinez stepped forward with diplomatic authority. "Gentlemen, you're all under arrest by joint agreement between the United States and Kenyan governments. This facility is now under international protection pending a full investigation." As the gunmen were detained, Frank finally allowed himself to breathe. But his relief was short-lived. Sahara was still in critical condition, weakened by the traumatic birth and the stress of the attack. The tiny cub, though alive, was barely strong enough to nurse. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a veterinarian flown in with the rescue team, knelt beside Frank to examine Sahara. "Dr. Morrison, what you did here, performing surgery under fire, it's unprecedented. But she's lost a lot of blood and the cub needs immediate supportive care." Frank looked down at the lioness who wore his daughter's necklace, her breathing shallow but steady. "Doctor, I need to tell you something about this lioness. She's not just any animal. She represents a promise I made to my daughter 8 years too late." As Dr. Harper worked to stabilize Sahara, Frank told the story of Sarah's conservation funding, the betrayal by Blackwood, and the necklace that had started everything. With each revelation, the gathered officials and journalists understood they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple conservation dispute. "Dr. Morrison," said Agent David Chen from the FBI's International Crimes Unit, "we've been tracking this hunting operation for 2 years. Your evidence and your actions tonight have given us everything we need to shut down the entire network." Frank felt a presence beside him and turned to see Mary Ochieng, her face streaked with tears of relief and exhaustion. "Dr. Morrison, the elders want you to know. You are now considered a warrior of the Maasai people. Your courage tonight has honored your daughter's memory." As dawn broke over the Maasai Mara, the full scope of the previous night's events became clear. The international media attention had forced multiple governments to take action against the hunting operation, Blackwood had been arrested at the Nairobi airport trying to flee with nearly $2 million in cash. The Texas hunting lodge that had been purchasing the lions was under federal investigation. But the revelation that shook Frank to his core came from Jake Thompson, who'd been quietly working with the FBI for months before Frank's arrival. "Doc, I need to come clean about something. When I changed my name after Sarah died, it wasn't just because of guilt. I'd been investigating the people who killed her." Frank's world tilted sideways. "What are you talking about? Sarah died in an IED attack." "No, she didn't." Jake's voice was heavy with 8 years of carried secrets. "The attack was staged. Sarah had discovered that some of her conservation funding was being diverted to illegal activities. She was going to report it when she got back to base. The people running the hunting operation couldn't let that happen." The truth hit Frank like a physical blow. His daughter hadn't died in a random act of war. She'd been murdered for trying to protect the very lions he'd just risked his life to save. The necklace around Sahara's neck wasn't just a childhood memento. It was evidence of Sarah's last act of love and defiance. Agent Chen confirmed Jake's revelation. "Dr. Morrison, your daughter's death triggered a joint military FBI investigation that's been ongoing for 8 years. Tonight's events have given us the final evidence we need to prosecute everyone involved, from the hunting lodge owners to the military contractors who arranged her assassination." Frank sank to his knees beside Sahara, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had been revealed. His daughter hadn't just been a victim, she'd been a hero who died fighting the same fight he'd just won. The lioness stirred at his touch, her amber eyes meeting his with what seemed like understanding. Dr. Harper emerged from her examination with cautiously optimistic news. "Sahara should recover fully. She's stronger than her medical indicators suggested. And the cub, against all odds, appears to be thriving." As Frank watched the tiny lioness nurse from her mother, Django approached the fence where Frank knelt. The massive male lion, who'd spent the night protecting his family from armed attackers, did something unprecedented in wildlife literature. He extended one massive paw through the chain link and gently touched Frank's hand. Mary gasped in her native language, then translated for the gathered crowd. "The elders say this has never been recorded before. Django is accepting Dr. Morrison as family, as protector of his cubs." Frank Morrison looked at his reflection in Django's golden eyes and saw something he hadn't seen in 3 years. A man with purpose, a father who'd finally kept his promise to his daughter, a protector who'd found his pride. Sarah's conservation dream lived on in the tiny cub nursing beside him, in the facility that would now bear her name, and in the old man who'd finally learned that love doesn't end with death, it transforms into action. The sun climbed higher over the African savanna, illuminating a scene that would be remembered in conservation history. An elderly American surgeon, a rescued lioness wearing a child's necklace, and a newborn cub that represented hope triumphing over greed, love conquering fear, and promises finally kept. 5 years later, Dr. Frank Morrison stood at the entrance to the Sarah Morrison Conservation Foundation, watching as his 73-year-old hands remained steady while adjusting the brass nameplate that gleamed in the morning African sun. The facility that had once been Blackwood's criminal operation now housed over 200 lions, employed 50 local staff members, and had become a model for ethical conservation worldwide. The tiny cub he'd helped deliver during that night of violence had grown into a magnificent lioness named Hope, whose own 3 cubs now played in the expanded enclosures that stretched across 500 acres of protected Masai Mara grassland. Sahara, now 11 years old, moved with the dignified grace of a matriarch, still wearing the faded but precious necklace that had started everything. Frank's morning routine never varied. He would walk the perimeter with Jake Thompson, now the Foundation's Director of Security, and Frank's adopted son in all but legal terms. Jake's daughter, Rebecca, 26 and fresh from veterinary school, had joined the staff 6 months ago, bringing the passion for wildlife that seemed to run in families touched by this place. "Dad," Rebecca called to Frank, a title she'd started using without prompting, "Dr. Harper wants to show you Hope's latest medical results. Her cubs are the healthiest we've ever recorded." Frank smiled at the word Dad. At 73, he'd gained more family in Africa than he'd ever lost in Colorado. Jake's marriage to Mary Ochieng 2 years ago had created a multicultural household that included 3 generations, 4 languages, and enough love to heal even the deepest wounds. The foundation's success had attracted international attention beyond anything Frank had imagined. The Sarah Morrison model of community-integrated conservation had been replicated in 12 countries. University students from around the world competed for internships at the facility. Most surprisingly to Frank, romance had found him in the form of Dr. Helen Matthews, Margaret's old college roommate who'd visited for the Foundation's 2nd anniversary and never left. "Frank Morrison," Helen had said that first evening over dinner, "Margaret always said you were too stubborn to die young." I see she was right. At 69, Helen brought her own doctorate in anthropology and a lifetime of adventure that matched Frank's newfound purpose. Their courtship had been conducted over morning coffee discussions about lion behavior and evening walks through the conservancy. This morning held special significance. The Kenyan government was officially designating the foundation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognizing both its conservation achievements and its role in preserving Maasai cultural traditions. President William Ruto himself would arrive by helicopter for the ceremony. Frank found Sahara in her favorite spot beneath the acacia tree where she'd given birth to Hope. At 11, she was elderly for a lioness, but her amber eyes still held the intelligence and dignity that had first captured his heart. When she saw Frank approaching, she rose and walked to the fence. Not the harsh chain link of the old facility, but a low wooden barrier that allowed easy interaction between humans and lions. "Good morning, old girl," Frank murmured, extending his hand. Sahara nuzzled his palm with the gentle affection of a house cat, their daily ritual unchanged by time or the presence of international dignitaries preparing for the ceremony. Jake joined them, now 50 years old but moving with the confidence of a man who'd found peace with his past. "Doc, you remember what today is, right? Besides the UNESCO thing?" Frank's face clouded momentarily. October 15th. 8 years since the night Sahara gave birth, 13 years since Sarah's death. "I remember. Rebecca wants to do something special for the anniversary. She's been working on a project with the local school children." As if summoned by her father's words, Rebecca appeared with a group of Maasai children, each carrying a handmade beaded necklace identical to the one Sahara wore. "Grandfather Frank," the eldest child, Peter Ole Sankale, announced formally, "we have made necklaces for all the lions, so they know they are loved." Frank's eyes filled with tears as he watched the children carefully place necklaces around the necks of lions throughout the facility. Hope approached the fence with her cubs, allowing 10-year-old Nasirian to drape a blue and white necklace around her neck. The scene was a perfect circle. Sarah's childhood craft project had become a symbol of protection and love that would continue for generations. The UNESCO ceremony attracted more attention than Frank had expected. CNN's Anderson Cooper, who'd been following the Foundation's story since its violent beginning, served as master of ceremonies. Representatives from a dozen African nations attended, along with Hollywood celebrities who'd become Foundation supporters. But the moment that stopped Frank's heart came when a familiar figure emerged from the presidential helicopter. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, now Kenya's Minister of Wildlife Conservation, approached with a guest who made Frank's knees nearly buckle. "Dr. Morrison," she said with a formal smile, I'd like you to meet someone who's been waiting 8 years to thank you properly." The young woman who stepped forward had Sarah's green eyes and Margaret's determined chin. She wore the uniform of the U.S. Army Veterinary Corps with the rank of Major clearly visible. "Dr. Morrison," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm Major Lisa Chen, formerly Staff Sergeant Lisa Kowalski. I was Sarah's partner in the veterinary unit in Afghanistan. I've been working with the FBI to bring down the people who killed her." Frank's world tilted as memories crashed together. "You were there when she died?" "I was supposed to be in that vehicle with her and Jake. Last-minute duty change saved my life." Lisa's composure cracked. "For 13 years I've carried the guilt of surviving when she didn't. But when I learned what you'd done here, how you'd honored her dream, Dr. Morrison, Sarah would be so proud." The ceremony proceeded with speeches about conservation and international cooperation, but Frank heard none of it. His attention was fixed on Lisa, who'd requested permission to place a wreath at the memorial garden Jake had created for Sarah beside Sahara's enclosure. As the sun reached its zenith, President Ruto presented Frank with Kenya's highest civilian honor. "Dr. Morrison, your sacrifice and courage have not only saved hundreds of animals, but have shown the world what one person can accomplish when they act from love rather than fear." The celebration continued into the afternoon, but Frank found himself drawn back to Sahara's enclosure as evening approached. Helen joined him there, slipping her hand into his as they watched Hope teach her cubs to hunt with the patient intensity of all mothers. "Any regrets?" Helen asked softly. Frank considered the question seriously. He'd given up his comfortable retirement, his financial security, and his safe American life. He'd been shot at, threatened, and had spent 5 years working 18-hour days in conditions that would challenge men half his age. "Just one," he said finally. Helen looked surprised. "What's that?" "I regret that it took me 3 years after Margaret died to find my way here. Sarah left me a road map, but I was too lost in grief to read it." As if responding to his words, Sahara approached the fence one final time that day. She was moving slowly now, age and the African heat taking their toll. But when she reached Frank, she did something she'd never done before. She lay down beside the fence and rested her massive head against the wooden barrier, her eyes closing in complete trust. Frank knelt beside the fence and rested his hand on Sahara's head, feeling the rumble of her contented purr. Around them, the sounds of the African evening came alive, birds calling from acacia trees, the distant laughter of foundation staff, the playful growls of Hope's cubs learning to be lions. "Margaret," Frank whispered to the African sky, "you were wrong about one thing. My heart wasn't too big for the world. The world was exactly the right size for a heart like mine." The stars emerged above the Masai Mara as Frank Morrison, once a broken widower contemplating suicide in Colorado, now sat surrounded by the family he'd chosen and the legacy he'd built. Sarah's necklace still adorned Sahara's neck, a bridge between past and future, between love lost and love found. In the distance, Hope roared, not in distress, but in celebration, her voice carrying across the savannah like a promise that some things, once saved, remain saved forever. Frank Morrison's story isn't just about saving lions, it's about discovering that your most meaningful chapters can begin when you think your story is over. At 68, Frank felt invisible, useless, forgotten by a world that had taken everything he loved. Sound familiar? Many of us reach retirement feeling like we're just marking time until the end, surrounded by empty rooms and fading photos of happier days. But Frank's journey from a pill-counting widower in Colorado to a lion-saving hero in Kenya proves that purpose doesn't have an expiration date. When he risked his life savings, his safety, and his comfortable American existence to honor his daughter's memory, he found something precious, a reason to wake up excited each morning. His story reminds us that our deepest pain can become our greatest purpose, that the love we've lost doesn't disappear, it transforms into the courage to love again. Frank discovered family in Africa, romance in his 70s, and meaning in the most unexpected places. The question isn't whether you're too old to start over, it's whether you're brave enough to let your heart guide you to where you're truly needed. What meaningful legacy from your past could become your future purpose? Have you ever felt too old to pursue something that called to your heart? And what stopped you? Share your thoughts below. Your story might inspire someone else to take their own leap of faith.